Successful Blunders, historias de fracaso que inspiraron el éxito. Puedes conocer más en successfulblunders.com. Con ustedes, Alberto Lugo.
Welcome, my friends, to a new episode of Successful Blunders Podcast, where we talk about failure with successful entrepreneurs so you can learn what not to do in your business so you can scale up quickly. We want to thank our audience and our viewers because you're watching this show on YouTube and you can also hear it on different platforms via podcast. Remember, if you're watching this on YouTube, click the like button and subscribe and hit the bell so you can receive different announcements. And in this episode, we're going to welcome the one, the only, Mr. Bob Dávila. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, Alberto.
Bob is a former chairman of the board of Grupo Guayacan, and he's been doing a lot of things over his life as an entrepreneur. So we're very honored that you are in the podcast, and we want to start by asking you, who is Bob Dávila for our audience, and what do you do?
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm delighted to be and honored to be invited to be part of this podcast. I'm a New Yorker. I'm what you call a New Yorican. Born and raised in New York. Went to college in New York, NYU, and ultimately started off in banking quite a few years ago, probably longer than some of your audience before they were born. And got into traditional banking, found that very boring, and then got into the more entrepreneurial banking, which basically back in the 80s, would have been the leveraged buyout business, where we had more entrepreneurial type of investors buying the divisions of companies and outright companies that were being managed poorly or managed in ways that were not terribly entrepreneurial. So that's where I learned to do mergers and acquisitions and private equity investments, and then ultimately wound up doing that in the U.S., in Latin America, and in Puerto Rico. As well as for a few years in Brazil. Eventually, I decided that rather than being the financier and investor, I wanted to see if I could actually be an operating entrepreneur. And so back in 1998, I left. I used to work for Chase. I left Chase, Brazil, came back to Puerto Rico, partnered up with some of my old customers / clients, investors, and wound up being in charge of the group buying outdoor media display posters, which was at the time the largest outdoor advertising company. Built that over 4 years, sold it to Viacom, and then wound up being called by the board of Guayacan to see if I could help them develop their strategy a bit more, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
That's where we met, actually. And so you come from the other side. You were actually investing in these failing businesses, and then you decided to pursue it on your own.
Right, exactly. I was, I said I got to prove to myself that I can actually be an operator, not just a finance guy.
And that's great. And that's great for this podcast. So I would love to go in real quick and start the conversation around a blunder or a failure that you had in any of those past experiences. Sure. So go ahead.
Well, I have two fun ones. One, at the same time I got involved with the outdoor advertising business, our investment group decided that it wanted to invest in agricultural commodities in Puerto Rico. In other words, people thought that Puerto Rico, being where it is and an agricultural center, there might be a great opportunity to build a big business in agricultural commodities. And so there was a business out there that we identified that was very successful. I won't get into the details because there's a lot of controversy around this one.
Don't worry about it.
But we wound up because of the history of the company, we wound up investing in this company, and within 2 years, it was an absolute utter failure. It went broke. We lost all our money. The banks took a big hit. And it was an absolute disaster. And so we'll talk about the lessons learned in a second. The second disaster was also at around the same time. This would have been in '98, and for those of you old enough to remember, that was the dot-com boom era.
Correct. Yeah.
And so everybody was going to become a dot-com entrepreneur. And we had a couple
millionaire.
Right. and so we had a couple of Puerto Rican entrepreneurs come to our little investment group and say that they wanted to create the Latino music portal. The portal that was going to have Latin music be sold and understood everywhere in the world. We said, oh, it looks pretty interesting. We invested some money in it. And then within 6 months, we realized what a disaster that was.
Wow, that was very fast.
That was very fast. And the common theme in those two, as well as the other failures that I'm not going to bore you with, is that what we did was we made decisions based on unvalidated assumptions. We would do things based on what we saw,
our gut,
right? But also things that you couldn't validate. So when you look at, for instance, the agricultural commodity business, okay, you can't validate the weather, as an example, right?
Yeah, of course.
If you're relying on commodities, you don't control prices. The prices are set in the market, okay?
That's also true, yeah.
And so you can't validate that either. And you can't, and especially if you want to export, especially to Europe, you can't validate currency gyrations. And so without the ability to validate any of those things, we made a significant investment in there, and everything turned out, absolutely wrong. So, certainly our lesson there, and certainly my lesson there, was I am never going to make another investment in a business unless I can validate the key components of the business model in some form or other. That doesn't take the risk out of it, but at least you have data and facts to support the decision making that you make.
But let me ask you something, without going into details. What about the team? Because most of the time what I heard or when I see a television show such as The Prophet, which is very similar to what you were doing before and when you did that, he's always talking about the team and specific characteristics of the people running the business, not just these assumptions. What did that had anything to do with the problem, or just these unvalidated areas that you didn't saw coming or you couldn't validate?
Well, very much the team, because the non-validation started with the teams themselves. In other words, they come up with their business model. They come up in those days business plans. And when you look at them, you can read a 30, 40-page business plan, but then if you really get into the detail of what's behind there, you realize that people are making decisions based on lots and lots of assumptions that they have not themselves validated. And their history their history and their brains tell them, well, look, this has worked in the past, so of course it's going to work in the future. And then as investors, we compound the error by then not forcing the validation at our stage of the game. And so they didn't validate it, we didn't validate it, and therefore the disaster occurs. And so they're good people. They're very, very smart people. But
the business model was not validated.
But it just wasn't validated. And I think a lot of people don't realize this, but once these things happen, I tend to be perhaps more academically oriented than the average entrepreneur.
Yeah.
So I started doing a lot of research. I started doing a lot of reading, and I discovered that the failure rate, whether you're talking about startups, whether you're talking about existing businesses, whether you're talking about product development, the failure rate is like 60, 70, 80%. And then the question is, with all these smart people, why do we fail so often? And so one of the biggest answers is the way our brains work. we are destined to failure unless we do something differently.
You got that from the research, so this is pretty common.
It's very common, right? 80% of all startups fail after 5 years. 70 to 80% of all new product development dollars goes down the drain. As an example,
I think when I went to Guayacan and I think you shared that in the first 40 minutes of my first class at Guayacan Venture Accelerator, and I was kind of scared because our business was not growing at that time, but we were been in business for at least 5 years. So I said, like, maybe we're almost failing
right,
because of the statistics, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, when I tell that to people, a lot of people, wait a second, I'm in business, so I haven't failed. And so they don't believe me. And what I go back and tell them is, you're where you are today because you've basically been lucky. Okay. You've been the 20% that didn't fail, but it wasn't because you made validated decisions. It's because you got lucky that you were right based on the circumstances that you had no control, no knowledge over. So,
yeah. I always say that you have to make some good decisions in an ocean of bad decisions or horrendous decisions just to be successful. I think Bill Gates have said that in the past. You just have to be there at the right time and make the right call so you could move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And the same thing occurred with the Latino portal thing. I liken it to Netflix. So when Netflix, people don't know this, but when Netflix first started, it was an absolute disaster because they wanted to become the movie entertainment portal, and what they discovered very quickly was that it takes a lot of money to code, to get customer acquisition, all those things. It costs a ton of money. And at the time, the business model of served ads just didn't pay the bill. And so they really had to change their entire business model. And the same thing, I mean, we didn't know this about Netflix at the time. If we did, we wouldn't have made the investment, right?
Yeah.
And the same exact issues came up with our Latin portal thing, which is, wait a second, this is way too expensive to try to develop and make some money and survive. So you would just have to keep on putting tons and tons of money in the process.
I can imagine the burn rate because you said they fail at 6 months after the investment. So I can imagine the burn rate monthly that you decided not to keep pursuing it.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we were smart in the sense of we used traditional venture capital investment approach, which is give them enough money to prove the next point, to prove the next the proof of concept, and it became pretty quickly obvious to us that after 6 months, this wasn't really going to come anywhere near what the assumptions were behind it.
So you're a professor. We can expand a little bit here on lessons learned and what do you learn from this experience and what you were telling me about the brain, how the human brain works. Can you expand on that at least?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things, as you know, and you went through a GVA, which has evolved over time. I teach the first course in GVA, and what I try to do is get the participants. And for those of your audience not as familiar, GVA is the Guayacan Venture Accelerator.
Yes, please explain what it is for the audience.
The Guayacan Venture Accelerator is a program put together and spawned. Well, I was a co-founder of it, and Grupo Guayacan now gives it every year. It gives a cohort of 10 selected companies, so you have to apply for the program, and 10 to 12 companies come in every year, and it's basically probably a bad example, but an MBA for growth-oriented entrepreneurs. And so there's a series of courses. I do the first one, and then there's about 7 or 8 other courses that you take over several months. And then at the end, and then the objective is for those companies. These are established companies that are out there, and they want to really change the acceleration of their business, grow their businesses more dramatically. And that's what the program is designed for. It's not, the enterprise program is for the startups. This is for established Puerto Rico companies that really want to change the trajectory of their businesses.
And I can attest to that, because before taking the course or taking the program, I thought I knew it all because I was being quote unquote successful, but I had so many areas or so many gaps that I had to cover, either with more people in the business or myself, that things that I didn't know. And it really sparked the interest and made me go in a journey of learning and keep learning and keep seeking more and more information to just thrive the business. And I'm forever grateful for being there at that time. I think it helped us tremendously. And we made changes right away when we took the course. So we were making changes every week when we were going to these courses. And it paid really well. In the long run.
Yeah. And so, like we were starting to talk about, what is it that what I try to get across in the course is, our brains, the brain is wired to be extremely lazy. Okay. It doesn't like working hard. And so because of the way the brain is wired, it's got things like, risk aversion associated with it. Okay. It's got something called confirmation bias. It's got something called recency effect. These are all things that we as entrepreneurs and as customers, we make decisions based on things that have been encoded in our brain over our lifetime. And anything that's different from what we've encoded, we tend to avoid. Okay?
That's true.
Right. And so whether it's trying to get a customer to buy something new, that's hard because they're encoded to not make many changes. Okay. And as entrepreneurs, when we try to do something more innovative, we tend to be very risk averse and not go out there because of the way our brains are wired, in terms of risk averseness, in terms of confirmation bias, and any new data that comes in is stuff that 95% of the time, if it's inconsistent with our what we call schemas, we reject it. And that's where the innovation opportunities are. By taking that information that's inconsistent with what your brain's telling you and say, wait a second, maybe there's a new way of looking at this. And that's where the real innovation opportunities occur. And that's where you also do things like make less mistakes, or at least make less stupid mistakes, because you're actually opening yourself up to new data and new information, and are prepared to validate assumptions that you've made.
That's where the magic happens. And let me say something. That also helps you fail fast and move forward with the next thing, because if you're not wired like that, which most people are not, you just try to make things work because you think it's going to work, or you don't want to fail, or you don't want to take the hit. So you could spend a lot of time, and I want to give back the example on the 6 months you invested in this company, and you said, this is going to be too much money. I don't want to go in that road. I don't want to pursue that, and move forward and take the hit. But you could have been there for years trying to make it work and losing money just because you're not wired to go fast and keep going with another thing.
That's right. If you work off of this unvalidated assumption that Latin, digitized Latin music is going to be the biggest thing in the world, no matter what it costs to do that, you're right long term, right? You're right over 15 years. But the problem is the business model you have at the time doesn't provide enough cash flow to support that growth. And so the question becomes where does that cash come from? And it wasn't going to come from us. And the idea, frankly, was, maybe 10, 15 years ahead of its time, which is frankly what happened. You guys know this as well in the technology field. Sometimes they're incredible ideas, but they're probably like 10 to 15 years ahead of their time.
Yes, I've heard that Uber was made 20 years ago or 15 years ago and didn't work because the market was not ready.
Right. Absolutely.
And let me ask you something, Bob. How can entrepreneurs try to train their brain to not do these stupid mistakes, or how can you try to teach your brain to do better?
Sure. In GVA, and I'm going to share some of the secrets of GVA with your audience.
Just enough for people to apply. Just enough for people to apply.
Right. Oh, that's right. There are two tools and one overall concept. Okay. The overall concept is something that we all learned in high school. Some of the smarter ones of us, I wasn't one of them, learned it perhaps in elementary school, is using the scientific method. Okay. And then the tools that specifically we use the scientific method around are the business model canvas on the one hand, and design thinking on the other. And without getting into a lot of detail, what those two tools do is it gives us the opportunity to, as objectively as possible, map out what our assumptions are, so we can acknowledge that these are assumptions. And one of the greatest things we do in the program is we get our companies to map out their business models on the business model canvas, and then I proceed to ask them, okay, how much of what you have in there is fact, and how much of what you have in there are assumptions?
It's fiction.
And after thinking about it for a little while, they all realize that 90% of what they have on those business models are all assumptions, because it was all created in their own heads.
Yeah.
This is what they think the customer wants. This is what they think works for the customer.
Well, I want to circle back and say that I was not able to take the business model canvas when I did Guayacan, but I did it with you guys at a later date, and it was mind-boggling because you see so many errors that you can fast forward in a day of planning, really, with that simple
amazing, huh?
that you guys provide.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I did a few years after was when I went to Stanford. I did the design thinking course, and we iterated out 6 times in a day, trying to build the ultimate men purse. And it was eye-opening to see all the crazy ideas, and then researching with other people in the room, and not to mention the other program that Guayacan has, where you have to interview like 100 people. And you really can validate your idea. So these are things that make you think about it, and make you also fail in weeks, not months.
Yeah, and it's a structured. You say, how do we train our brains to deal with this? Well, it's going to be tough to train your brain, because your brain is a very, very stubborn thing to do, a stubborn thing to change. So if you at least use these tools, and you accept that these tools can help you bypass some of these biases that you have, then you're going to really reduce the amount of mistakes, or certainly reduce the stupidity behind your mistakes.
Will you recommend doing design thinking sessions with the team every now and then, just to keep the brain?
Teams, every business, in Puerto Rico and the world, frankly, should have a business model canvas that they're looking at least once a week, and then having a design thinking exercise, whatever works for the team, whether it's weekly, whether it's monthly, where you're really getting out there and testing some assumptions. You're going to find, when you look at your business model canvas, is that you've got some really crazy assumptions here that you've been working on that you better test. And so you use the design thinking model to then test that assumption. It's a nice little structure that gives you the opportunity to test those assumptions.
Like the distribution channel, that area of the canvas, it's toughest for me.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about it, right? Whether it's
everybody's gonna buy it.
How do you access your customer, right? I mean, there's the physical distribution, there's the digital distribution, there's the awareness, there's the branding awareness, concept of it. There's a lot there, and so it's very, very powerful.
Yeah, everybody will buy it because we build it.
Yeah, well, if I had these tools, if I had these tools 15, 20 years ago, I might have, reduced. I think me and my team sort of intuitively understood some of these concepts, but since we didn't have the tools, we went
Maybe
further.
I would even go to say that maybe you could have help those entrepreneurs be more productive with the investment that you guys make, because you could pass them through that uh, training, and then in a couple of days or couple of weeks you could decide if the distribution was all right, if the idea was okay, or
Right.
if you had to pivot.
Right. Absolutely. And so, it's very, very powerful stuff. And fortunately, I don't make many more investments anymore. But certainly in the last 5 years, my mistakes have dropped dramatically.
Right, Bob. So we're almost at the end of the podcast, and I want to wrap it up with if we can summarize the learnings from those two mistakes that you had in your past lives.
The learnings are recognize that most of your decision making, most of my decision making was based on thoughts and assumptions in my head that weren't valid, and so I needed to figure out how to validate that. And if I couldn't validate it, then don't do it, because without being able to validate something, you don't do it. Recognize that everybody else around you, your team, suffers from the same issues of working off of assumptions. So as a leader, one of the things I try to do, if I ran a business today, the first thing I would do is get the entire team around the business model canvas and around design thinking, and have them understand and accept that these are ways that we're going to make much, much better decisions going forward. Because if we take this approach, we're going to take a lot of the unvalidated assumptions out of the equation. And then the other thing is, with those tools, you can really let people go. If they're practicing those tools and using those tools, as a leader, you can step back and say, go ahead, go do your thing, make your mistakes, because I know that if you use these tools, those mistakes are going to be faster and cheaper, and we're going to learn so much more by doing it faster and cheaper. And acknowledge that mistakes are part. If you're going to be an innovator, mistakes are part of the game, failures are part of the game, but let's do it faster and cheaper.
I love the feedback, and I love the lessons learned, because they hold true to everything that we've done in the past. And every time we use those two approaches, which we don't do it every time, but we have done it in the past, it's so much easier to make decisions. So I'm grateful that you're sharing that. And for the people watching this show, or at least listening to it, we're going to put the links to these two resources so you can at least learn a little bit about it, and then learn a little bit more about Grupo Guayacan. So if you're in Puerto Rico, or maybe now with the Corona that we're doing a lot of remote stuff, maybe you can apply and leverage what Bob is telling us here in the podcast so you can scale faster.
Great.
Thank you, Bob, for being in the podcast and for the information provided. Really helpful. I want to remind you guys to follow us on social networks, and remember that this podcast, you can read the transcription of this podcast in successfulblunders.com. Thank you, Bob, for being here.
Thanks, Alberto. It was a pleasure.
Successful Blunders, historias de fracaso que inspiraron el éxito. Puedes conocer más en successfulblunders.com.